Okay, so this is Daniel Lambert, and I am here with my friend and former colleague Bill Cushing. And Bill is a poet, and Bill's latest poetry collection is This Just In, a poetic journal of news stories, fake and otherwise. I love that title, Bill. Could you tell us about how this new poetry collection came about?
Well, actually, it's interesting because the title of the poem or the title of the book is actually came from one of the poems. Um, I started getting into ekphrastic writing. There's a website out of Canada that does this where they would provide a painting or a picture or something, and then you'd have like a week to produce a poem related to the imagery. And I got caught up in them so much that I said, I should take these poems that have the associated art and create a book out of that. And the This Just In was the poem that I really enjoyed writing quite a bit. And it seemed like a great title for a book, given it was sort of a play on, how often we've heard the fake news over the last, 3 or 4 years, certainly. Um, and also, it dovetails off, like I say in the book, is I started actually as a journalism major. Uh, so it was sort of my attempt to recreate journalism in a book of poetry. So the ones I chose, besides the ones with the illustrations, obviously, were pieces that related to news stories or opinion pieces, if you will. The movie poem obviously is kind of like the feature section, uh, where you get the movie reviews and that kind of thing. So I had that one. Uh, but yeah, I just put it together from the point of view of if I was going to put together a poetic newspaper, as it were, this might be it. So, so it sort of fell into place out of that one poem, the one titled "This Just In," which was one of the ekphrastic pieces, which is the last one in the book, actually. So.
Yes. Yes, I like your introduction to this book because in your introduction you talk a little bit about your first poem and how you started writing poetry.
Yeah.
And would you like to talk a little bit about your first poem?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. That was probably '88.
Wow.
I'm trying to remember now. Because I went back to school much later in life. I was 30, 37, 36, something like that when I finally returned to school. And when I got in there, I got roped into the school newspaper because of, my original major. And I just happened to have the paper advisor as one of my English teachers, and he liked my writing style, and we got along fairly well, and he invited me in. Uh, and it was funny because I first told him, well, I don't know, let me look because I'm working, I'm going to school. But then I found out that the newspaper editors got scholarships. I said, well, you didn't tell me that to begin with. So, being the mercenary I am, uh, and we went to a big regional conference for community college newspapers in Tampa Bay, and I attended this workshop, and the workshop was entitled "How to Improve Your Writing." And I'm like, well, that's always good to hear, and let's see what. And I got in there, and basically the woman running the workshop just said, "Hey, try writing poetry because if you can write poetry, you can write anything else. The discipline that poetry demands will carry over into any other form of writing you're dealing with, whether it's business, technical, I don't care what it is." And I said, that's a great idea. I had never thought of it.
No.
Um, and then as it happened, at that time I used to run, and I was out running the town, and I saw this church in the background, and I've always loved old architecture. Religious architecture is great stuff, I think.
Yeah.
Not that I'm particularly religious, but man, the architecture is great. So I'm running toward this church just to check it out, and on the way I found this old 1950s style airtro type of diner. And so when we left the next morning, I said, "Look, we got to go by this place I found for breakfast before we head back," because we were driving to Jacksonville, West, where we were from. Uh, So we stop in this diner, and then it just hit me. I said, well, this is a good place to start writing poetry. And that's where the poem, I don't know if you've read it before, the In Pink Neon, which is in the first book I wrote. That's where that came from, was
Oh,
that experience. And from there, I just got caught up in it. And like I say in the book, journalism was no longer a consideration. I mean, not that I didn't continue doing it because I got paid for it and that sort
yes,
of thing, but as far as my major and my direction and my own writing went, I was like, that's out the window now.
yeah. I wonder if you had much of a background in your childhood with reading and writing. My parents told me I started reading the TV Guide at an early age, which was an interesting thing to start with. But were your parents
Well,
interested?
my parents, yeah, obviously, and they encourage reading, but I got caught up in it. I was I only went to public school till fourth grade, except for one hiccup my junior year when I got kicked out of a school and had to go back. But um, I was very lucky that the instructors I had from fifth grade on
Yeah.
assigned, to my mind, very good reading material. I mean, some of it I got caught up in, and then just being around a situation where academics was, really celebrated. Like, okay, I loved reading. Yeah, I got into it right away, and I did a little bit of writing creatively, short stories, things like that. Or once again, the newspaper was basically my biggest source of writing, commentaries and stories and that kind of thing. But yeah, I always grew up reading. Uh, my father, in fact, God, we didn't have a color television in the house until much later. I mean, he just hated TV. Uh, and so, we had one TV in the house, and like I say, it took years before we even had a color one in there. Uh, so, yeah, I pretty much read. And of course, these private schools back then, you had to read at least 3 or 4 books during the summer. They would give you those summer reading lists. So, yeah, it was just a natural thing for me to read. Although, like I say, poetry was not a major part of that up until I hit my late 30s.
Wow. Do you have any favorite poets?
Well, I love Ferlinghetti and Philip Levine too. I really like his stuff, but I really love the craft of Sharon Olds and Gwendolyn Brooks, and I always like to think I'm trying to strive toward the types of things like Brooks in terms of the narrative and Olds in terms of the imagery.
Yes.
But I always love Ferlinghetti's stuff, and Philip Levine is one of the writers one of the poets I really admired from early on.
I've seen that, reading your poetry, there are, many free-form poems. I think you have a few that adhere to one of the forms of poetry, but I wonder if you have any favorite forms of poetry or like the
Not
sonnet.
really. I'm a big believer in and when I teach writing, I always emphasize this: is form follows function.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll start out. I mean, I've started poems that were one way and end up completely another way. I'm thinking probably the most obvious one that comes to mind. I wrote a poem called "Sonnet for Slaughter," and it's about
Yes.
the Civil War.
Yes.
And I wrote it, but as I was writing, I ended up. I said, you know what? It did not start as a sonnet. It ended up that way. And when I wrote it and I presented it to a writing group, somebody mentioned. They said, look, what you got here is something that might fit the sonnet form very nicely because you've got all the elements. You just don't have the rhyme scheme and the number of lines. I said, oh, let me try it out. So I was really pleased with that because you're again taking that advice from somebody else. It ended up taking third place in the Scheibel sonnet competition, I think 2 or 3 years ago. But yeah, I sometimes I start with I want to follow this format, which has been more recent, probably about the last 6-7 years. I've started writing in more classical forms or established forms, just because I wanted to see if I could do it. I'd done so much free form stuff. I was like, let me try and put restrictions on my style, on my format and see what I can do. But if it doesn't work, then I go, well, I'll just can it and take it another way. Whatever seems.
Yes. I remember Ray Bradbury having the advice, when he was talking to the writers club that I belonged to, and he said, yeah, if you have writer's block, you should, change what you are writing, try to write in a different form, whether it's a story, change it to a poem. If it's a poem, maybe try changing it to a story. Of course, that doesn't help with my students who are, assigned to write a research essay, but I think sometimes it helps when I ask them to change the format or the structure in such as, because sometimes people don't think about.
There was a poem I wrote years ago when I was living in Puerto Rico, and my wife then, my late wife now, obviously, but the woman I was married to in Puerto Rico, she had a cousin who lived in the mountains of Puerto Rico. The strangest, it was such a cool place to go to because he was such an odd character, and his house seemed to fit him. And I wrote this poem about his place. And no matter how I wrote it, I just didn't. Every time I look, I said, this is not working. And I finally went, you know what? It's not a poem. It's just not. And what I did was I took the images that I had in the poem, turned them into prose, and inserted them into a short story to build up the character of the protagonist of the story. And it worked. I was like, yeah. So I found a place for it. And then there's pieces I've written in prose and I've extrapolated into poetry. I don't know if you saw which I'm still really working on, but there was the one Spectrum issue about death, and I wrote about my late wife. It was called To a Woman Still Alive. Yes. That poem came from the writings I had about her.
Yes.
So yeah, I form follows function. I always say that.
Yeah.
If it's not working, try something else.
There's a poem in your latest collection, just in a decima for the Doughboys, and it reminds me of the recurring theme of war. In fact, I think you have a couple of poems in that collection about World War I, and I myself have written about war. What is it, do you think, that compelled you to write about World War I?
Well, remember we had the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I a few years ago.
Yes.
And I just went on a tear on World War I pieces. There was poems I wrote about it. And those two, The War to End and the Decima for the Doughboys. Or decima, I'm not even sure if I'm saying it right. But here again, a decima is one of those forms that I follow. And actually, I think the other one, the War to End, also follows a specific form.
Yes.
I can't remember which. But that's sort of, I have to say, I was probably most inspired after seeing Peter Jackson's movie, They Shall Not Grow Old. I don't know if you saw that, but it was an absolute beautiful work of art. And as I'm watching, I said, this is because really, World War I, you could say, is the first modern war. Although I would argue, you could almost say the Boer Wars were in a sense, but in terms of mechanization and that sort of thing, World War I is really it, because you had, like I mentioned in some of the poems, you had cavalry, but you had, airplanes and tanks and all these new developments. You always had artillery, but you didn't have it to the extent you had it in this war. So yeah, World War I, and World War I's always been of interest to me.
Yes.
When I teach about propaganda, I talk quite a bit about World War I because of the propaganda posters and all the other stuff that came out of that war.
Yes, I
kind of went on a tear on that topic.
Yes, the film from Peter Jackson, as you say, is wonderful. I saw it a few years ago when I was on a flight with my wife to Alaska on vacation, and you mentioned that in your another poem from the collection. So yes, which brings up our shared interest in movies. So what do you think inspired you to write a movie list poem?
Once again, I wanted to write a list poem, and I could think of no better topic than what are my favorite movies. And so I started thinking, just these are the ones that have stood out to me as more than just film, more than just movies, works of art. And like I say, probably I guess West Side Story is the first one I mentioned, because I would say that was the one that really got me into movies. I mean, you figure, look, what was I watching up to that point as a kid? Jerry Lewis, Three Stooges, Godzilla, stuff like that, which is okay. That's all well and good for a kid. My mom takes me to see West Side Story, and I was just floored. I was like, my God, nobody told me you could do this stuff with a camera. And I was like, this is great. And it just hooked me right into it. And then El Cid followed after that. And then, of course, Casablanca, which I always say is my absolute favorite movie of all of them.
Yes.
But then there's a lot of others.
Mine too.
Yeah.
Well, you have some of the movies on in your poem that really made an impact, or had an impact on me, like Altered States and the first Star Wars movie. Das Boot, L.A. Confidential.
Yeah.
I can certainly understand your interest in film, and you and I have talked about Saving Private Ryan and other war movies before. I wanted to get back to one of your earlier, I think your first poetry collection, The Farmer Life.
Yeah.
That was inspired by a personal tragedy, and I'm wondering if you would like to talk a bit about that, or how that came about.
Well, of course, it's interesting because, what I'm really proud of with this particular, that first collection is that people have reacted to it in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I think the best review I got of that book was, of course, when I was marketing it through Finishing Line. I had a couple of old high school friends who bought it just to help me out. They are not necessarily poetry fans or anything like that. But one of them, after he got it, he posted on Facebook, and I always love it. He says, "I loved it because I didn't have to, I didn't feel like I was a dummy reading the poems. That I could follow what you were talking about." And I said, that to me is what I was trying to do, is connect with people as much as possible. Thematically, there's a lot of, well, it's funny because, there's tragic events in there, obviously, but I've always thought that there's a lot of celebratory stuff in there as well.
Yes.
I tried to make it as much of a snapshot. The former life is my own look at my own life. As we grow up, we go through so many different stages that you can look back and say, well, there's this segment of my life, and then there's this one and this one. In fact, the book I'm working on now is funny because it's basically got inspired by my writing group, who somebody mentioned, said, well, how did a guy who was working in shipyards become an English professor? I'm like, well, let me tell you the story. So I'm basically writing a memoir about my years in the Navy, and then afterwards working on oil tankers and fishing boats and whatever else.
That's great.
The former life, I was really pleased with the way that shook out. Because when I started it, and actually, I don't know if maybe you know this name, John Brantingham, I know him from Mount Sac, where he teaches there, but he's also, he's an editor with several magazines and this sort of thing. And I went to him, I said, look, I want to put a book together, but where do I start? And he gave me some really good advice on how to assemble it. So I have to give him a thank you all the time, because he helped me put that book together very nicely.
That segues to my next question about teaching. And I had a teacher at Del Camino College who would say, as a writer, try to have a day job that does not demand very much of you intellectually. And when she found out I was an English teacher, she said, "Oh, you did not take my advice." And so, what do you think your teaching career has contributed to your poetry?
That's funny. By the way, I can't resist the line of, if you're an English teacher, you start out behind. Because it's not like science where you can do multiple choice or math.
Right.
Okay, just go through. I would say probably the biggest thing I've gotten out of from my teaching experience, uh, because I do sort of separate them as much as possible, but a lot of times I'll do writing exercises with students, and I'll participate as well. And it's produced some fairly. I mean, I've gotten 2 or 3 poems out of them. I got one short story. Um, so yeah, doing these arbitrary writing exercises where you start with a prompt, and I tell them, I say, look, I'm gonna be doing it right alongside with you,
It's
and
great.
that's produced some pretty good stuff, I think.
Oh yeah, that's a great idea. Yes, to do the assignment yourself, so you're not just asking the students to do something that and then sit back and wait for them.
I don't scribble, and hey, 'cause like I say, and I tell them, I say, you'd be surprised how many good ideas I've gotten out of this kind of thing.
Your second collection is Music Speaks,
Yeah.
which you call that a chapbook though. So maybe
Well, actually, technically speaking, I would say this just in as a chapbook
it's
as
a
well.
chat. Okay.
Only because it's not. I mean, it's 41 pages, but
Mhm.
quite a few of them are the illustrations, so it's a much shorter piece. But yeah, the Music Speaks that was the one that took the I think 2019 the Spectrum chapbook contest. So I submitted it to
Very good.
Don, and he
Yes.
first place.
Don Campbell. Yes.
Yeah, and I was so pleased with how that one had turned out. I said, you know what? I want to repackage it and make it slicker, and that's where I created the kind of offbeat dimensions of it, as well as using the illustrations here again to correlate with the poems, or most of them at least. And also, and what was fun was, of course, if I sent you that one, is
Yes.
the encore section, because after the contest was over, that was when Dr. John I forgot the name now. The singer of the Araby and all that. I can't believe I'm losing his name.
There it is.
Oh, Redbone, Leon Redbone. Yeah.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, because Leon Redbone and Dr. John died right after, just so I
Oh.
was putting the book together. And I said, well, what plays off music better than having an encore? So I put that in as kind of, all right, here's 2 new poems that came out since the festival contest, and put it together in that. Yeah, I was really pleased with it, and I was really proud that it ended up in 2021 winning the New York City Book Award, or one of them. I was 3rd place, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I too tend to be inspired. Maybe is the wrong word, but when the person that I admire passes away, I mean, you have somebody like Peter Green just passed away, but in the last year. But do you find that you have an idea for a poetry collection first, or just you find
I would say,
write poems on a particular theme first?
well, in Music Speaks, obviously that was one because he was looking for chapbooks. I had a ton of music poems. I said, well, this seems like a good theme for a chapbook. For the This Just In, I tried to gather from the, not just the illustrated stuff. I mean, obviously that was the backbone of it, was having the poems with the artwork. But then I said, well, I need more than that. So I kind of chose what seemed to fit that sort of media template type of thing. Now, if I'm hoping to get to work on another book of a full-length book of poems, probably won't be until next year, I wouldn't think, because I'm trying to get this memoir finished up and at least first draft done, which I'm still several months away from. But yeah, once that gets done and I've got it in the pipeline, I'm going to go back and start assembling another book of poems. Now, how I'm going to organize that is anyone's guess. I'll probably just assemble all the titles, look at what I've got, and say, okay, how am I going to do this? And do I want to make it thematic as an overall book, or like I did in the first one where I divided into people, places, things? just categorizing each poem according to what overall subject it seemed to fit. I had to laugh because probably the biggest criticism I got, or negative criticism I got on that book, was a lot of reviewers like, well, why things? Why did you choose? Well, I had nowhere else to put them, so it seemed to fit. I couldn't put it under places. I couldn't put it under people. So it's a thing.
It's a thing, sure. Well, my next question is based on the book by Stephen King on writing, where he says that he does most of his writing in a doctor's waiting room, or at least a large portion of it. Do you have a particular place or time where you prefer to write?
I would say pre-writing happens any place. I mean, it can be in the car. It can, and it has been. In fact, the poem "Getting Old Is" started with that image of the homeless guy down on Olympic and Concourse. Yeah. And I think I grabbed a napkin from our glove compartment and started, scribbling some stuff there, and just take it home and start working on it from there. But as far as sit-down writing, yeah, I try and do that. I'm usually late at night, after my wife has gone to sleep. Then I'll sit down with my draft and start writing, and then what I can do then the next day is print that out and start revising it and then adding to it and that kind of thing. But writing, I here again referring to Philip Levine, I remember I went to one of his workshops and somebody asked him, they said, well, where do you get your topics for poetry? And he just pointed out the window, says, it's right out there. Live life and you'll find it all over the place.
Yeah, the science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, I think, was tired of hearing that question, where do you get your ideas? So he said, Schenectady, New York. You send money. I send money every week, and I get a six-pack of ideas in the mail.
Which is kind of funny, given that maybe Vonnegut did the same thing.
No.
Since they both were connected to Schenectady.
From the same, yes, yeah. Somebody probably heard the other one say it. So, based on the wit and wisdom of Stephen King, he also said, if you don't have time to read, you don't have time to write, which I found to be true. Well, we talked about some of your, favorite poets, but do you have a particular genre that you like to read?
I always say anything well written. Now that doesn't mean I'm not a big fan of fantasy. Not a big fan of sci-fi, but here again, if it's well written, I mean, I've read the Dune series. I've read I like Michael Moorcock,
yes,
his stuff. But I'm not a big fan of those genres. Horror is another one. Okay, I'll read it, but fiction in general, I really like. Nonfiction, I just finished a book called Blind Man's Bluff, which is a history of the Cold War and submarines.
Oh.
I got that actually from my sister because our dad served in subs.
Oh.
Obviously before the Cold War, but I was here again. I was part of that Cold War. I mean, I was surface ships, but I also, I'm reading this. I remember a lot of these things going on. But I'm now reading the memoir. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Jeanette Wall's The Glass Castle. I'm hoping to get a little inspiration from her for my memoir work.
Yes.
My favorite, I have to say, well, I love Vonnegut. John Gardner, the American John Gardner. The Brit is a mystery writer, not my particular favorite genre. But I always love, from the Americans, John Gardner. I always say, I think he was 48 when he died. And I'm like, if you look at most writers, they don't hit their full tilt until their 50s.
Yes.
You look at what this guy did before he was even in his 40s. It's like, my God, it took 10, 20 years to think of what he would have produced then. Because I've always been impressed with his work. Probably my favorite, though, in the English language, now, because I love Isabel Allende's stuff. But Anthony Burgess, I think, is the greatest 20th century English writer. And I know that's blasphemy for an English teacher to say, because I'm not mentioning Henry Miller or Gatsby. It's like, no. Anthony Burgess, I think, is one of the greatest craftsmen of language that I've ever run into. I just absolutely love his stuff, and not just from the point of view of the scope and the breadth of his writing, but he wrote critical essays, he
Yeah.
did translations. Uh, yeah, he's like, I look at him and I'm like, how? And I don't know if you're aware of this one. I always loved this story. Was I guess it was in the 40s or early 50s. He was diagnosed with brain cancer,
Oh,
and he was told he only had a year to live. And he said to himself, "Well, I got to provide for my wife." And he cranked out like 5 novels,
oh my God.
and they're
That's
like the
amazing.
Speed was one. The Doctor is Sick is another one. I'm trying to remember. But yeah, he just said, "Well, I got to provide some income for my wife because I'm going to die." Of course, it's funny because he did outlive his wife actually.
Oh,
Died
oh,
much later, but because he was 80, I think she was in her early 80s and he was in his later 80s when he passed away.
hmm
But I read his stuff. I mean, when we went into the lockdown, one of the first things I did was pull out a lot of my Burgess stuff and started reading that first, and then I don't know what you did during the real extreme.
I did a lot of reading. I discovered that I could use my Kindle to watch films. For some reason, I just thought of that as something I could use for reading. But yeah, speaking of Anthony Burgess, I was in a bookstore and I just picked up a copy of Clockwork Orange, and then I just am amazed by the kind of language that was invented for that.
Yeah. He
Or
did
the,
the same thing in 1985. He wrote a novel called 1985, which is really
oh,
unique because his version of 1984, and like the street gangs speak Latin.
yes. Oh,
He's such a well. He knew like 5 or 6 languages intimately, and it was
amazing.
yeah, and it was like Greek and Russian and German, and yeah, and in fact, he wrote a book, Napoleon Symphony, which is a fictionalized version of Napoleon's life. But what Burgess did,
Oh,
he divides it into 4 sections, and each section he tries to pace the writing to Beethoven's Third Symphony, which is
okay.
Napoleon Symphony. And one of
Amazing.
the things with Burgess I always find is when I'm reading him, you got to have a dictionary nearby because he throw words that you've never seen and you have to understand. Here again, he's one of those very deliberate writers. If he picks a word, it's for a very specific reason. And so if it stands out, you better know exactly what it means in that context. And there's one word in Napoleon Symphony I still cannot. I don't even know whether it's French, Italian, or what, but I'm sure it's got to be one of the dirtiest jokes in the world.
Oh.
Because I've spoken to, here again, language teachers. Oh, you teach French? Have you ever seen this word? No, I don't know what it is. It's got to be some sort of slang, either Italian or French, that means something really bad. The setup of it, as soon as I hit it, I got to find out what this word means. But yeah, I've always been impressed. And Earthly Powers, I think, is the greatest novel. I don't know if you're familiar with that one at all or not, but
No.
it's a great study of the 20th century. Much like if you've ever read Agende's Infinite Plan,
hmm
where she takes the whole period from probably the 50s up to the 80s. In this, he goes from the 1920s up to the 80s. And just really dissects politics, religion, all kinds of stuff. Yeah. By the way, he also has what I consider one of the greatest ending lines to a book. Uh, The Man of Nazareth, which was Burgess's book about Jesus.
Yes.
And I always love the end of it because it's the Last Supper, and it's from the point of view of the waiter. There's, bringing the food and the wine and everything else, and right before and the last line is the waiter. Finally, everybody's settled down, everybody's full, everybody's ready to go. He says, "To whom do I give the reckoning And Jesus says, that would be me. And that's the ending line.
Oh my God.
That's great because the reckoning also meant the bill. Who gets the
Yes.
bill, but also who gets the reckoning. I said, but that's a great line. He also wrote, and here again, Earthly Powers, the opening line is considered one of the best ever written.
Hmm.
So yeah, he's a hell of a writer.
No, it's funny that you mentioned, reading Anthony Burgess and then, saying you need to know the definitions of these words. And I remember, an English instructor I had at El Camino College again, who was, having us read the novel Ragtime. And he said, one of the things you need to do is have a dictionary handy.
Yeah.
Don't just assume from the context, what the word means. And sometimes with my students, I tell the story of the word masticate, that there was a guy on the radio in the morning who would like to say, I masticate every morning in front of my wife and children. And then people would call in and say, how dare you say that word? Yeah. But so.
Yeah, that's funny. That is funny. I do the same thing. Actually, it's kind of funny because in my critical thinking classes, I would focus on Orwell's Politics in English Language.
Oh.
Many cases where I'd say, notice he says, for example, he talks about dying metaphors. I said, notice he doesn't say dead metaphors. He says dying. Why did he choose that word instead of dead? And it opens up why is he writing this thing?
Well, do you have any advice, Bill, for beginning writers or especially poets?
I think anybody. One of the best pieces of advice I ever heard came from a woman we interviewed for a magazine that I was with. She was a photographer, but I always love what she said. She says, artists need to be sensitive enough to find or tune into things that are worth using as subjects, whether it's writing, art, photography, music, whatever.
Yes.
You also got to be tough enough to take the criticism you're going to get. So yeah, it's
yes.
And I think it depends on why you're writing. If it's just for yourself, it doesn't matter what you do. But if you're writing to be read, get ready.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because somebody's not going to understand it. Somebody's going to read it or something that they shouldn't. You're always going to have that, and the only thing you can hope to do is minimize that number. You're never going to write to please everybody. You might as well forget that. But yeah, be prepared to get criticism, and if you're not prepared for that, don't put it out in the public. That's that would probably be the biggest. And then of course the other one is I always love the I don't know who said it, but the what is it? Write without fear, edit without mercy.
Oh yes.
And yeah, that whole you got to be willing to rewrite it and rewrite it.
Yes, and I've heard the cliche, write what you know, but then I had a story out there called Right of Way, which was about, it's not much of an original idea. It's kind of an homage to Harlan Ellison's Along the Scenic Route, where cars in the future have guns mounted in them, and you can get points by shooting, destroying, the other people in the other lane, and but and my own grandmother said, but you don't have a driver's license. How do you know so much about driving? And I said, Grandma, it's science fiction.
Well, I wasn't aware of that. So he was picking up road rage long before Grand Theft Auto.
Oh yes, and the cars would have these little signs, I guess electronic signs, where you could type in, go to hell. I mean, I don't want to say something too explicit, but you could actually send messages to the car behind you.
It's funny because whenever people talk about what superpower would you like, I always said, man, I would love to be telekinetic. Because if somebody's driving the way I don't like them, I could just lift the car up, move it off to the side of the road.
Especially, you and I know about the LA traffic.
Oh boy. Although I will say this, and it's one of the things I've always, ever since I got here, and it's maddening to me too. But of course, I came from New York too, so we're not known for courtesy and everything else. But I would say no matter how bad the traffic gets here, it's worse in Puerto Rico. Believe me.
Okay.
I actually stopped driving when I was down there. It was so funny because at one point my father-in-law said something about, well, you need to drive. I said, no, I don't need to. What you're saying is I need to go psychotic. No,
Yes.
I don't. It's an
Yes.
inconvenience not to, but I keep my sanity.
Yeah, my wife is from Saigon, and she was talking about the traffic there and just how there's no red lights, or well, she said the other day, well, the thing is that the roads were not really designed for automobiles. I mean, they were designed
for horse carts and stuff like that. Yeah.
but they drive a lot of motorcycles, or the way she says it, motorbikes. But yeah, I've seen some of the films of the, it seemed like controlled chaos.
Well, I went to high school with a guy from South Africa, and we were talking about driving, as we were approaching our senior year. And he said, in South Africa, if you get in a car wreck and it's an isolated area, whoever's the biggest guy is in the right.
Oh.
All you do is you get in a wreck, you just give them as much money as you got and hope that's enough to keep them happy.
That makes sense. Okay. I guess that has some logic to it. Would you? So I'd very much like to hear one of your poems.
Yeah, I would love to. And actually, I was thinking, I don't know if I can I share the screen here?
Oh, yes.
Let me do that. I wanted to, since this book does deal with artwork, and since we are in the month of Halloween here,
yes,
I thought I would read this piece along with the painting that sort of inspired it.
Absolutely. You should be able to share your screen.
Yeah, let me go ahead and do that. And this is kind of like my my ghost story.
Yeah.
Let's see, is that it? Should come up. There we go. Yeah.
There you go.
So the painting, is this early 20th century female painter. The painting's called Women in Black.
Ooh.
So going off that image, I came up with this kind of a ghost monster story, I guess. And this is Disappeared Dreams. And it's on the page 20. It's about midway through the book. As this place at the foot of the mountains moves from dark into day, black-clad women bend under bone-white bags draped over shoulders. Stealing people's dreams along the blue avenue, these shadow babushkas grip full sacks in their left hand, holding our reveries like bales of cotton. One kneels at the road's shoulder, having dropped her duffel, revealing her face from beneath a sooted cowl. Had any vigilant villager been aware? Another stoops to scoop back the spilled contents, but worries after the distance lost by the delay, as a trio of doppelgangers trudges past, bringing their bounty to the realm of Morpheus, where demons can gather to dine on our evening's fantasies.
Bravo.
So that was, yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you. That was the story I got out of that one. But
That is amazing. They say, the picture tells 1,000 words, which is so true. Is there the best way that we can obtain your writing, Bill?
well, of course, my books are all on Amazon. Can be found that way. But I always like to say, look, and feel free to give them my Yahoo email, and if anybody wants, I have copies here. I can sign them for people and send them out.
Oh, great.
And certainly we'll work out a deal with whoever's interested. Obviously, if it's local, it's a lot easier.
Yes.
Anybody who wants, just pick up some of the postage. I'll cover some of it.
Oh, that's great. I'll put a slide up on the screen with your email address.
Hmm?
And then,
Yeah.
That's
They just
wonderful.
want to write to the Pisces Poet address and say, and if they have questions on any of the books, which might fit, whatever, I'm more than happy to, like I say, always happy to talk about my own writing.
As we all are. I think that's probably our, it's always fun to talk about one's own writing. Absolutely.
I know.
Well, thank you, Bill, for spending this time with me. And this has been a
Thanks
very,
for giving it to me. I'm always,
yeah,
you know,
very educational and entertaining and rewarding conversation. And so, Bill Cushing, poet and author and teacher. I look forward to your memoir, and look forward.
I'm hoping. It's funny because when I started it, I said, "Well, I should be done probably by May or June," and then I got, "Well, maybe by September." And now it's October, and I'm like, "No, hopefully by the end of this year."
Good.
I'll be done with it. And I do want to get back to. My MFA creative thesis was a memoir about my late wife.
Oh.
But it needs a lot of work, and I want to get back to that. So probably when I mentioned, I'll probably be putting together a new book of poetry, but also be juggling the time with rewriting that original memoir about her, and hopefully get that out into the public eye. I would love to, because that one was more. It was a very weird situation that I did my first semester at Goddard, actually starting the book that I'm doing now, the memoir about my time in the Navy and that stuff.
Yes.
But then she died during that first semester I was in Goddard, so I took a semester off, and when I went back after the time off, I said, forget that book, this is what I want to do. And so I wrote this book from the point of view of one of the things I noticed when we were dealing with her disease and all the chemos and everything else. There's lots of books out there for the people who have cancer. There's not many for the caretakers. What are you going to run into? What's your life going to be like? And so I sort of tried to write it from that perspective of even though it's about her, it's also about us, and it's about my involvement. So those are going to be the two big projects once I get this thing, the memoir I'm doing now done. Which, like I say, hopefully by January or February.
Well, I look forward to it. I think that probably like with many writers, when you ask what is your favorite piece of writing, they say it's the next piece or the piece that I'm working on now.
I'm working on now, yeah.
I think that you will be helping others who are also in that situation as caregivers. I know we've all lost loved ones, but I think that this will be especially helpful maybe and help people with the healing process who have lost their spouse, as you did. So thank you very much, because I think that.
By the way, not to take away from my current marriage, we just passed 25 years. So.
Oh, that's nice. That's great. Yeah. Well, are there any last comments or advice for the listeners?
No, I mean, if anybody wants, and here again, if they'd like to be in touch in terms of any readings I have coming up or anything I've got going on, certainly they can contact me through the email there. And, I sort of put a mailing list together. I'm sure I've plastered posters and flyers to you on occasion. So.
No, I enjoy hearing from you.
And by the way, if people would like to know more about this book, Don is doing a thing with him, myself, and two other writers who we all are through CyberWit. And I'll send you the poster, certainly.
Very cool.
We're going to do something the end of this month, online, of course. But it's all people who have been published by CyberWit.
Wonderful.
The publisher who did this book.
All right. Well, we look forward to it, Bill. Oh, thank you.